Hello, folks. Welcome. Happy Friday to everybody. We're so glad to have you join us today for a very important conversation in partnership with the GAHCC and the Inclusion Plus Institute. My name is Brittany Rodriguez. I serve as the Chief Operating Officer with the Greater Austin Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. And I am so glad to be here today and joined by two members of the Chamber and dear friends, Alejandra Milky and Venus Piñeiro de Joyas. They will be joining us as industry pros, helping us to understand more about honoring tradition and cultural heritage with cultural competency. With this, folks, this is, again, a topic that many of us know all too well. We've seen it, but it is not unique to Latinos in particular. Certainly, while we've grown up understanding that from a historical and cultural perspective, we are deeply tied to the traditions that we hold most near and dear to our hearts. Of course, with ongoing globalization and ongoing inclusion of new cultures and folks to our state, to our country, we begin to see that our own deeply valued and beloved traditions have become more accessible and more popularized. We've seen this across the board. And while it is beautiful to share with so many the things that we hold so dear, our traditions, our heritage, in many ways, we've also come to understand terms that unfortunately also have gained a great deal of popularity. Words like cultural appropriation. And again, in this case, we realize not unique to Latinos. Very simply, a few examples of this. We're all familiar with the song, Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog by Elvis Presley. Unfortunately, Elvis did not release this song first, nor was it his hit. He re-released it in 1956. It was originally released by Big Mama Thornton, a Black woman on the rise, creating a name for herself and helping to establish the rock and roll industry. She continues to be lauded in the Black community and is considered a main staple. Additionally, we see examples, most recently with Riverside, California teachers, unfortunately donning crudely pasted together Native American headdresses and dancing around while chanting. In this case, we also know very well, in the case with West Side Story, a beloved musical, none of the cast were Latinos, unfortunately portraying many Latino cultural aspects. So in this case, we realize that this is not new. These are not new moments or instances. And with the rise of popularity of movies like Disney's Coco, again, these traditions are becoming household recognizable moments to realize and appreciate. In this case, what we hope to do is work with the Inclusion Plus Institute in an effort to better understand the tradition of Dia de los Muertos in particular, understand additional cultural heritage preferences, practices, styles, and manners, but also honor them appropriately. So in this case, what I would love to do is certainly hand the conversation over to two women who are leading the charge in changing the understandings of the importance of recognizing, honoring, and including so many folks along with their cultural traditions in a more professional capacity through the workplace as well. And while I can certainly speak to the very, very noble work being done by the Inclusion Plus Institute, I will leave it to the experts of their own organization. With that, Alejandra, I'm glad to hand it to you.
Thank you, Brittany. Thank you very much for the introduction and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. We're very happy to be here with you today. We're very happy that you are here. I'm glad to be here with everyone. The Inclusion Plus Institute would like to welcome you to today's webinar, The True Meaning of the Day of the Dead, a journey into celebrating traditions with cultural competence. My colleague, Venus Piñeiro, and I are the founding members of the Inclusion Plus Institute, which is a training and education arm of Vector U, that is Venus DI boutique consultant firm. Venus has more than 20 years experience in top-level management positions in different tech companies here in Austin, and is a DEI certified executive and leadership coach, among many other amazing things that she has. And I am Dr. Alejandra Rodriguez Milky, and I'm honored to collaborate with Venus in this Inclusion Plus Institute. I have a lot of years experience, unfortunately, many years working already as a researcher, as an educator, trying to improve the educational and professional lives of the Latinx community here in Texas and across the USA. Right now, I'm also a executive and leadership coach for resilient and determined Latinas and executives who are committed to develop the necessary skills to become more inclusive in their work. So with that, we welcome you here, and we are looking forward to have a very lively discussion about the topic. Venus.
Thank you so much, Alejandra and Brittany. We are thrilled to be here to talk about Dia de los Muertos. But before we get there, we are here as session one of a two-part series with the ultimate goal to help you bring more inclusivity into your life. And we want you to keep in mind three things in this journey. First of all, this area is a deeply human area full of nuance. And we want to share that we are all learners in this journey, regardless of where you're at, if you're starting that journey, if you're becoming curious, or if you have spent time reading and researching and learning. The second part is a very important and very near and dear to our hearts, which is we think that we all own our impact. Sometimes the intention and the impact might be different, but we want to share with you that as you go through these different conversations, you own the impact that you have. And then the last part, the journey to become more equitable and more just and more inclusive, many times goes against deep socialization. And when we do that, we feel discomfort. And we just want to share that feeling that discomfort is a sign that you are going through that journey of learning. Can everyone see my screen? Just a tech check.
We can.
Okay, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, well, we want to share this very beautiful concept from Maya in Lakesh. Although it is not something that Alejandra and I personally grew up with, we wanted to share with you because the notion of it deeply connects with the idea of unity and respect for all of us that we want to nurture through these conversations. This poem was written by a Chicano playwright, Luis Valdez, and originally published in El Teatro Campesino. And we want to read that for you as we begin.
Tú eres mi otro yo.
You are my other me.
Si te hago daño a ti,
if I do harm to you,
me hago daño a mí mismo.
I do harm to myself.
Si te amo y respeto,
if I love and respect you,
me amo y respeto yo.
I love and respect myself. We're going to invite you to go into a reflection that deeply connects you to the meaning of the Day of the Dead. If you could take 60 seconds to think about somebody that you love that is not around, whether you knew them in person or you admired them from afar, and think about one fond memory or teaching from them. If you saw them this afternoon, what would you tell them? I'm going to give you 60 seconds just to think about that. There is a link on the chat. If you could click on that, and if you feel inspired, please share with us your memory. It's all anonymous, and I'm going to share with you a little bit of this. And right now, what we're listening to is the Yaqui dances. It's called Erangua Loco. Thank you for all of you that have shared thus far. Please continue sharing. And I'm going to read a couple of these thoughts. Abuelo Humberto taught me that laughter and family were the most important things. He was always joking and laughing. Making tamales with my favorite tia, while the work felt lengthy and took hours next to my family members, they mean so much to me now. I get goosebumps as I read these stories. A former professor who taught my first year in seminar in undergrad and passed last year around this time taught me that when working with communities, we should build relationships and ask what they need rather than impose their own ideas. Mi abuelo Guillermo loved for traveling, and I truly inherited that. He called me La Pequeña Viajera. My grandpa bringing me paletas and candles from Mexico because they taste different from the ones made here. I can vouch for that. Being from Monterrey, where Topo Chico comes from, I can tell you that Topo Chico also tastes different. Thank you for sharing. My grandfather taking me to the sugarcane fields to take real sugarcane. It is the most delicious thing I'd ever tasted. And I'm going to share one last one. In the January of my grandfather, who passed away in January of 2017, would always tell me that the more you do for people, the worse they treat you. Some wisdom. What you have done right now is pause in your life, and you have actually done what the celebration of the Dia de los Muertos is really about. This is about bringing the essence of those that have departed with thoughtful attention and reflection, honoring them, maybe smiling at those memories. And this is one of the most important things as we're celebrating traditions that are maybe our own, that are not our own, that we really get deeply into that meaning of what that is and what that is alike. Thank you for everyone who shared. We had a lot of grandfathers, a lot of our ancestors that have taught us so much. And I do want to read one from my tia, because we didn't hear a lot about tias and tios, spending time just laughing and enjoying the little things in life. She helped me to understand that life can get tough, but there's so many things we should be grateful for. So many teachings, so many learnings. Thank you, everyone.
Excellent. Well, thank you for sharing. And we are going to then learn about the origins of the Day of the Dead, or Dia de Muertos. And first, one of the things that I want everyone to know, because as it's important for us to understand the origins and the importance of these celebrations. This celebration was listed in 2008, became part of the list of the intangible, and it's there. Let me just go to my cultural heritage of humanity. So it's a process, it's a candidature, and UNESCO was able to recognize this festivity as part of this intangible cultural heritage of humanity, which is a big deal. It's an important thing. So let's go and see what is the origins of this celebration. And we have just a few minutes to talk about history here, but the history of this celebration is fascinating. So whenever you have time, And if you have extra hours or there, go and take a look at that. It's fascinating. So the origins of this festivity go back to the rituals and the beliefs of the Aztec, the Toltec, the Nahua, and other indigenous cultures. And that death was a natural phase in life's long continuum. For them, death was not the end of life. It was just the end of one cycle and the beginning of another cycle. Actually, for them, death was the beginning of life. In the Aztecs' creation story, what happened was that several gods, and of course, it's very complex. I'm just giving here some points, but Aztecs believed that several gods had to sacrifice themselves in order to sustain the weak god who had himself sacrificed himself to create the sun. Similarly, they believe that human beings came to existence when another god, so-called, sacrificed himself by dripping his blood over some bones of a dead and man and woman to create human beings, human life. The Aztecs had a very sophisticated and complex afterlife. The way they understood the world was deeply connected to death. And they believed that what's going to happen to you after you're dead was related or connected or determined by the way that you died and not by the way that you live. What we understand nowadays or in the Christian or Western world. So depending how you died, it was going to be your future in the afterlife. There were layers of heaven and paradises, multiple paradises, and there were layers in the infra world, on the underworld. If you die as a warrior, you would go to a certain paradise in the east, and you would be with the sun as the sun would come up every day. If you were a woman and died in childbirth, you would go to a different paradise, and you would go along with the sun as the sun set in the evenings. If you died violent deaths with water or difficult diseases, you would go to another paradise. And if you died of natural diseases or the more common ways of dying, you would go to the infra world, that it would take 4 years to reach the infra world. So as we can see, death had a prominent role in the Aztec society. It was something that was elaborated, that was well thought of, that they truly believe in this connection between the living right now and what's going to happen after that. Now, of course, since it was such an important aspect of society, they had a lot of festivities, right, that were dedicated to the dead. They honor the dead ones who have already passed, and they honor two main deities of the dead, the Lord of the Dead and the Lady of the Dead, that I'm not going to pronounce the names, so you can see them there. And these festivities were, these two deities, let me tell you, they were the rulers of the infra world, but they were, the role was to welcome the souls when they die. They were also supposed to protect the bones of those who have died. Now, these festivities were usually took place between July and September of our calendar now. And they were full of food, sacrifices, offerings, all kinds of offerings. Now, the legend tells us that the Lady of the Dead, this goddess of the dead, during these festivities for the dead, would dress up and allow the dead to raise to the surface to visit the relatives. She would accompany them, and she would also protect the journey using these bright colored flowers and pasuchos to light up the path. Now, these celebrations about the dead also coincided with the harvest celebrations, in which the Aztecs shared with their ancestors, the ones who were coming to visit, with the first harvest. They would share with them the first harvest. So this indicates a very clear reciprocity between the dead and the living. The offerings to the dead were a way to honor the role in giving back to the living. The Aztecs believed that none of this could happen. None of the harvesting, the growing, the cycles where they could get their food, none of this could happen without the support or the help of the ancestors. So because it was them who had taught them how to do this, and it was them who would also go to the soil, to the earth, to feed their plants. So the dead, guided by the goddess of the dead, the Lady of the Dead, were allowed a transitory return to earth, and they would be honored by the living by giving them the harvest, the price of the harvest, the food, in a way that they could continue helping the living once they went back to the earth, to the infra world. Now, what happens later, as we know, the Spanish came, the Spanish brought Catholicism with them, and there was an encounter of two worlds, right? The Catholic Spaniards tried to conquer and evangelize indigenous groups. The indigenous groups tried to resist that. And of course, as more powerful, the Catholic Spaniards were able to impose a lot of their beliefs on the indigenous groups. What happened was that out of that encounter of two worlds, of that mashup of two systems of belief, and it's interesting to think about how there are certain things about Catholicism that were able to fit in the view of the Aztecs. But from these two systems, a new system was created, right? And so what happened for this festivity of the dead was that instead of being celebrated in July and September, what is now July and September, that festivity was transferred, was moved to be celebrated in the when we observe All Saints Eve, All Saints Day, All Souls Day in Christianity. And with this move, this holiday was nominally connected to Catholicism. However, it's important to remember that a lot of these practices and beliefs are deeply associated with our indigenous roots. But that's some of the story.
Thank you, Alejandra. Well, I want to share a little bit about La Catrina. This is a symbol that many of us have seen and is one of the most recognizable things that we know today in popular culture from El Día de los Muertos. When we dress and you see people with the skull and the flowers and the hats, this is what it is based on, La Catrina. But what is it? What is the origin? Well, first of all, I want to share that picture that you see on the upper right, El Catrín. If any of you have played La Loteria, which is kind of a version of what we might see as bingo, El Catrín is a very posh, dandy-like gentleman. So La Catrina was originally created back in the 1910s by José Guadalupe Posada. And what he was doing there, it was a satire, and it was a reference with the obsession that some high society Mexican had with European customs. So you see there that hat, it was supposed to be like one of a very stylized French hat. And his caricatures depicted skeletons and skulls for faces as the central figure. Now, they were, regardless of class or of status, they were all calaveras. But it also had a political meaning where there was a sense of a satirical obituary for the privileged class, the way that he saw it. Now, the original name for this is La Calavera Garbancera. And Garbancera is actually a nickname for Indigenous Americans who were trying to look European and denying their own heritage and scorning their own culture. So as you can see, this image that we now see over and over had many different meanings beyond just what we think of today as, well, it's a calaca, it's a calavera, it's the skull, it's the bones, and we can dress up very, very fancy. But it had a lot of meaning when it came up. But one of the important things with some of this is the concept that death equalizes all of us. Death is this equalizing force that at the end of the day, we all get there. And we need to be reminded of that as well. Now I want to share a little bit about the ofrenda. The ofrenda is an altar that many people place in their homes close to the Dia de los Muertos to honor those that are no longer here. There's so many elements that I want to share with you so you understand what that means when people create these altars and what are the symbolisms. But before I go there, I want to talk about the difference between November 1st and November 2nd. November 1st, also called El Día de Todos los Santos. It's a very old day that was arised in, I guess, the 9th, 10th century. And the Catholic Church was looking for one day to honor all of the saints that they have, many of them. And so they put together this one day. Now, later it became a way of also thinking about and honoring the children that have passed away. Some of the research says, children being very innocent, they're almost like saints. So children that have passed away also get honored on November the 1st. Now, on November the 2nd is El Día de Difuntos, o Día de los Muertos. And this is where the adults are honored. And there is some conversation around, well, when somebody dies, isn't quite there in heaven. They're going through that purification process. And that's kind of where they're at. And so that is at November the 2nd. Now, when you create or you see some of these altars, you might see many different altars with levels. The majority of them have 2 levels, which represent the sky and the earth. Some of them have 3, the sky and the earth and the underworld. And then some of them have 7 with different interpretations, whether it's the 7 deadly sins or the passage of the soul through many of the different stages. But when you look at the altar itself, let's start at the top. Many times there is an arch, and this arch represents the passage between life and death. Second, you have fire, and this is where you have candles, where each soul is represented by a lit candle. And people also typically add an extra soul for the forgotten soul. Then you have the papel picado, which is very colorful. It has holes in it to make different figures. And some people say that each of the elements of fire, earth, etc., are represented in an altar. And this represents the fire. Some people say that when the papel picado undulates in the wind, it's the souls of our ancestors passing by and passing through. You very often will see a picture of those that the altar is honoring. And then one of my favorite things is the copal, or the incense. Now, copal comes from the Nahuatl. Nahuatl was a language spoken by the Aztecs, and copali means incense. And this is made from the tree resin, and it's believed that it transmits the peace and the prayers, and it purifies the area around the altar. Now, it has another symbol, which is the transformation from the physical, the tree, the copali tree, to the supernatural in the form of the perfumed smoke. And also the rising smoke brings the prayers to the heavens, to the gods. It also is seen as a purifier. And it allows the spirits of our loved ones to enter our homes without risk. The next element are the flowers. These are the cempasúchil flowers. And I put there the pronunciation for those of you that are interested. And this cempasúchil also comes from the Nahuatl, which means petal, a 20 petal flower. And this is thought that the dead have lost their sense of sight, but they have a very keen sense of smell. And so with the flowers, we guide the souls of our beloved people back to us. And then also the vibrant orange yellow color in the Aztec mythology represented the sun, which guides the spirits on their way to the underworld. We have the salt, which is intended to stop the souls of the deceased from being corrupted by the earthly temptations, and so that they don't get tainted on their journey, and they can go back, they can come to the land of living and then come back the next year. Then I want to point out the pan de muerto. Pan de muerto is this delicious bread that is round, and it has kind of a little ball on top, with symbolizing the skull, with then four, I guess, four different lines coming out of the skull. Some people say that it represents the skeleton and the bones. But some other people also say it represents the 4 points of the pre-Hispanic cosmogony, and it is associated with different divinities. The favorite part of kids' ofrendas are the sugar skulls. And this is where they're very elaborate skulls, and the name of the departed would be inscribed on the forehead, also placing it to honor that particular spirit. And then finally, just the white cross. It represented the 4 cardinal points, but now it also, like Alejandra was talking, in this combination of the pre-Hispanic culture and the modern Catholicism representing Christianity and that cross. I'm not going to go into all the details about the directions, but I just found it so fascinating that I want to share with you that every direction has its own color and its own god, associated with energies of the old, of the young, feminine, masculine, and different elements. Really, if you're interested, I invite you to go and do a little bit more research on that piece.
And yes, and one thing that I like to point out is this celebration, Day of the Dead. It is, in essence, a celebration that came from the Aztec and Mesoamerica and the central and southern Mexico, as I said before. And there is, as it is, and this is something that is also very interesting. I was born, Venus and I, we were born in Monterrey, Mexico, that is in the north part of Mexico. And as that, even that celebration did not make it all the way to Monterrey in the way that it is now, right? We celebrated people who have passed away, as with the Catholic and the Christian holiday, but the Day of the Dead with the altars and the offerings, as we have seen them now everywhere, was not part of our growing up, because it was really situated in that central part of Mexico. Having said that, of course, there are a lot of similar celebrations in Latin America, right? Mostly because they are coming from the Catholic holiday, Dia de los Muertos, Dia de los Difuntos. But also, of course, these communities and these indigenous groups were very fluid. They were in contact a lot, right? So, of course, these celebrations have gone through other parts, like, and we have some of those festivities here listed here. Peru, Salvador, of course, they have something, but it's important to remember that where that one come from. And also it's important to remember how deep and how deeply connected it was to their essence, their identity as part of this culture. So it's important to remember that this Day of the Dead has a lot of depth and sentiment and power, right? So it's important to remember that. Now, part of getting all this knowledge and part of making sure that we have the knowledge so we can explain to others when they ask us about this. And I say, me as a Mexican, people are going to come to me and ask about that. And I want to make sure that I can provide this explanation and provide all the details necessary for them to understand the importance, the significance of the celebration. And all this knowledge allows you, starts making you cultural competent as a way to become more cultural competent. So we're going to start talking about that right now. You're on mute. You're on mute.
I have a saying that whenever I speak on mute, I send a chocolate to everyone that was on the call. So if you want a little chocolate, just send me a note. So before we go and learning more about how to celebrate this tradition or many traditions in a culturally competent way, we wanted to talk about cultural appropriation. And by the way, we will have a Q&A at the end of our conversation. If you want to go ahead and start dropping off some of your questions in the Q&A, please go ahead as we go through. We will try to answer everything. So Brittany talked a little bit about some of the instances of cultural appropriation that have happened in the past, in the 1950s and recently, and it happens still every day. So what is it? It basically means the unacknowledged and inappropriate adoption of the customs, practices, beliefs of a cultural group by members of another cultural group. Very typically, this is done by a dominant group or society in a way that reinforces stereotypes or contributes to oppression. Now, something that we all found very shocking is that the Walt Disney Company in 2013 tried to trademark the phrase Dia de los Muertos. As you know, if you gain a patent or a trademark with a particular saying, you own it. So essentially, they were trying to own this important cultural holiday in order to sell products. And as you might have guessed, they did it in anticipation of the release of the movie Coco, which, by the way, I love it. I love that it brings awareness into some of this celebration to people that had never heard about it before. But it's really interesting, the fact that a company would feel that they could take it, make it their own, and use it to sell products. Another part that is very important for us to remember as Halloween is around the corner. And Halloween and Dia de los Muertos, very different celebrations. But people like to have this jovial, carefree attitude to dressing with different costumes. And so something to think about when you're choosing your costume or your children are choosing a costume is the fact that using a costume that stereotypes a marginalized identity is never okay. It's offensive, and it usually perpetuates damaging preconception of marginalized groups. Let me give you a couple of examples. When people go and dress for Halloween as a trans person, very often you see men that are dressing with their stockings and in a very hairy-chested, scruffy-faced kind of way. And the reason that this is so offensive is that it's sending the message that transgender women are men in dresses. Transgender women are women. And when they step out in the world as their authentic self, they aren't wearing a costume. Something else that refers directly to what Brittany said with the Native American costume. When people dress as Native Americans and it's not part of their heritage, it reminds a lot of Native Americans of what they have and what they have lost. Even when it is historically accurate in the costume, it is trivializing the Native American genocide that happened. And it's also perpetuating very harmful stereotypes. What about dressing as a geisha? And we had a poll, I think, that we wanted for you to look at and answer, if you can do that. And as you answer the poll, I'm going to go ahead and continue talking about a couple more examples so that you can get the feeling of why this costume dressing is so important for you to be mindful of. People dressing as geishas, right? This is perpetuating this concept that that we have in the West of the lotus blossom and the stereotype of women being servile, passive, unconditional worshipers of men willing to pay any price and weather any kind of abuse in order to keep them happy. So we're going to end the poll and share the results. And this is anonymous. And for those that answered yes, and for those that answered no, we just want to say that don't feel bad about having used one of these costumes, because like I mentioned at the beginning, we didn't know what we didn't know. But now you know. Now you have the information. Now you have the responsibility. And now, before you dress up or before your kids get dressed up, you can take a moment to think and have a very thoughtful reflection. Is this appropriate? Could this be offensive? Why am I doing that? And more on that in a little bit. So thank you for all of those that answered the poll.
Excellent. So yeah, so like I said before, all this knowledge, all this understanding, this reflection is just the first step towards cultural competence. And cultural competence is an essential skill for any leader, for any person, especially nowadays when we live and work in diverse and multicultural workforces and workplaces. So cultural competency, or competence as it also can be called, is, think about it as a set of behaviors, attitudes, policies, right, that are required to effectively work, communicate with people who belong to different cultures in a way that acknowledges and respects my own culture and the culture of others. So I love the word competence because it talks about the capacity to doing something well. So in these terms, in this instance, is the capacity to effectively function as an individual or as an organization within a context that has people that belong to different cultures, groups, because they're going to have different ways of seeing the world, of being, of doing things. So cultural competence requires this cultural awareness, knowledge, like the one that we got today about this festivity, requires skills, how to do things, and requires intention, the intentional understanding that I might have to do things differently. Why is it important? Now, the business case for cultural competence is overwhelming. Cultural competence is the how to reach to that inclusion that is so necessary to create trustworthy relationships, right? Without cultural competence, organizations are not going to be able to attract and retain a diverse workforce. They won't be able to provide services that are effective and relevant to a diverse customer base like the ones that we have nowadays, especially in cities, in every city now. Cultural competence allows for leaders to understand what is needed to create a psychological safe space that can recognize, understand, and adapt across differences. And without cultural competence, organizations cannot be effective, cannot be productive, cannot be innovative, and cannot be efficient, right? So cultural competent leaders think about different communication styles, think about different systems of hierarchy, depending on culture, think about different values and priorities depending on culture, think about how unique and individual each person is. Now, when we try to implement and adapt this cultural competence to the Day of the Dead, we are providing you here with some tips of things that can be done, things that don't do them, and just things to be mindful, right? And we would love for you to share this with, especially in the coming weekend and in next week when we have the other dead, some things just to keep in mind when organizations are gonna have some kind of festivity, or an ERG is gonna have some kind of festivity. So number one, make sure that you go and look for the other's perspective, right? Like find people who belong to these communities, right? Who belong to these countries, and make sure that you ask them if they're willing to share those ideas, understandings with you. Always have that first attempt to reach out to learn more, right? Educate, learn about festivals, museums, right? Be careful and be choosy with the content and the websites where you get that, because there are a lot of things that are not 100% sure. However, just in the effort, you will learn a lot, right? And make sure that you, if as possible, try to give your business to these communities, right? Make sure that as a do not organize, or it would be the best idea not to organize an event that is solely focused on external representation, that is about a party, that is about having tequila shot, that is about dressing up with big sombreros, things like that. I just careful about not going into that joke party mode completely, right? To not mimic the tradition. If you don't have to, if you want to bring some of those things, if you learn more, of course, but just be mindful of what you're doing. For example, do not use copal because it's without disregarding the Asian ceremony use of this, right? Do not dress up to emphasize the stereotypes. And be mindful if there's a possibility of wearing some school makeup, right? Or a dress up like Katrina, for example, be mindful. Are we doing this to learn more, to experience the festivity, or is a way just to get more likes on social media or things like that? Now, this is a gray area, is cultural appreciation. Like some people might be more tolerant of having some of the symbols used in these more party ways. Other people might not. But when we, as outsiders of this group, when we ask first, when we try to learn, we try to experience and learn, that is a very first good step. Because it's always, like says on the slide, we're always navigating this thin line between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. So it's always been very reflective and what are we doing? Why are we doing that? Whatever we're doing.
If I may, Alejandra, as well, I'd like to mention and make note that oftentimes, and again, not simply unique to Latinos, but rather also experienced in the African American or Black communities. Simply, it comes down to asking. I know the question that we're on the receiving end of a great deal with the Greater Austin Hispanic Chamber of Commerce is, do you prefer to be referred to as Latino or Hispanic or Latinx? And in this case, I think for the most part, what we've come to understand is folks love sharing what personal preferences are. Many African-American community members prefer African-American. Many prefer Black. Many of us prefer Latinx or Latino or Hispanic. And in this case, I think that as a good jumping off point, simply arriving with a measure of humility and asking can make all of the difference. And what we know is that those moments and those shows of humility can often be the components that truly help to establish trust. And establishing that trust with our colleagues and those within the workplace, we know is very much established through really ensuring we are arriving with a measure of authenticity, logic, and truly empathy. I think for the most part, everybody is open and we love sharing parts of ourselves with one another. And when we invite those conversations, I think from the onset, that measure of inclusion is implicit by simply asking, what are your preferences? How do you identify? What should I know about you? It's a very simple way to get right to the heart of it, I think.
And also understanding that even Venus and I, we're both Latinas, we're going to have different perspectives on things. So we are not the same. Not all Latinas are the same. Even if we make almost 40% of the state of Texas, there's a lot of diversity within the Latino group. So it's okay to understand that I'm going to ask this person and I might only get her perspective, not the whole perspective of the whole Latinx community in
Absolutely. And, thank you, Brittany and Alejandro. The questions that you see up here on the screen are things that you can apply across any celebration. But what you're saying right now is kind of the middle one. And by the way, you will receive a handout where you can actually look at this after the webinar. But that second question, invite somebody else's perspective and frame your why, because each person that you interact with is going to have their own view, their own understanding, their own beliefs. And framing your why really brings back that aspect of humility, of saying, I want to learn about you. Going back to the In Lakesh poem, in you I see me, in me there is you. I respect you. I want to learn about you and your personal beliefs and traditions that might be part of your group, might be part of just you as a person. And when you do that, make sure that you thank the people that have shared their perspective, because this is often a very deeply meaningful conversation, right? I'm not just asking because I am a reporter. I'm asking because I care. I care about you and your heritage and your perspectives. And then before you do that, and a part of our handout is going to be a calendar of diverse celebrations. Own your learning. Go in and take the opportunity to do the research. How is the tradition pronounced? Where did it come from? How do different people celebrate it? What is the authentic way that different societies actually approach one celebration, which there might be many. And so having gone out of your way and spending the time in learning will show that indeed you're not just curious as a voyeur observer of somebody else's tradition, but you have you're putting your energy behind your statements of why do you do this. And then when you make choices, this information and this collaboration and sharing with another person will bring you to be able to make better choices, no matter what those choices are. And we have about 6 minutes left. We wanted to make sure we left some time for questions.
Yes, and I think we have a question. So, and I'll answer the question, but if Venus, do you want to tell about, I'll answer the question first then.
Yeah, I wanted to give the floor to John. John has been so incredible in helping us set up this event, and he's going to moderate a little bit of our Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Venus, and thank you, Alejandra, for sharing your insight on cultural competency and Dia de los Muertos. We do have a question in the Q&A right now, and the question is, what are your thoughts on the idea of cultural humility in place of cultural competence? In some recent DEI-focused conversations, I've heard individuals discuss cultural humility as the ability to respect and show you're willing to continue to learn about a culture, whereas cultural competence might suggest that there is a beginning and an end to learning about a particular culture and tradition. I've been grappling with this, and I'm curious what you think of that new phrase.
And yes, I can answer the question. And yes, there is, and these two concepts of cultural competence and cultural humility came from the medical field when people needed to understand how medical care had to be given differently according to your cultural group or your ethnic group. So the way that you understood pain, or the way that you understood the need to having family near you and instead of away. I mean, things like that. It came from that need to understand, okay, people might do this differently, so I cannot be the same with everyone. So that's kind of cultural competence understanding. Now they went to that idea of cultural humility as the next step in understanding, you're right, that it was an always learning process, that it was never this understanding that I know about Mexican Americans and about African Americans, so I'm done. So there was this understanding that there was always the learning, that you were as a learner understanding in that moment who they were and what they needed. So yes, cultural humility is, you can understand that. Now, if it's should you use one term, should you use the other term? Just understand that they are related, but one seems to convey more that idea of always learning and more, but it's okay. They're not totally different and nothing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess I wanted to add in a very simple way that I think about it, cultural competence means that you know that you are in the journey and that you will approach things with cultural humility.
Mm-hmm.
If I may, and ladies, I would love your perspective on this. A thought that's come to mind, certainly while so many of us, here for this conversation today are already well within our professional careers. What we know is that fundamentally our religious ideologies, our spending habits, our political preferences are very much established in the first 8 years of our lives. What we're exposed to at home and the teachings that we receive from our parents or those with whom we live. With this in mind, moving forward and as stewards for the community, advocating for this ongoing change and evolution of understanding, what are some of the actionable measures we can take now with our own children, with the next generation, to ensure that we're adequately being mindful and inclusive of these cultural sensitivities, and this need for, I like the phrase, cultural humility.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll give it a stab first. I have a 10-year-old, and just yesterday we spent 30 minutes on the dinner talking about cultural appropriation and using lingo or dialects of other people. And so my first thing would be, unfortunately, the news will have events that constantly make us face instances of cultural appropriation or injustice or racism. Bring that to your conversation with your children with cultural humility, which is to say, I'm not an expert, but you know what? This is what I think. What do you think? And so planting the seed of reflection in your children will really allow them to have that conversation with their peers as well. And so you might think that they're not listening, like my daughter said yesterday. What you said in the last 30 minutes, I didn't get anything out of it. But then you hear her chatting with her friends when they get back from school on their iPads, and they're actually having conversations that are related to this. So in short, don't shy away and communicate that there's so much more to learn, and it's a complex subject. Like we told Mia yesterday, it is very complex. And this requires probably many conversations that you will continue having into your adult life.
I would just add 2 words: courage and modeling. Have the courage to engage in these kind of conversations, have the courage to reflect and develop self-awareness, because what am I doing, right? And that look into ourselves, that mirror into ourselves can be tough. Like, what am I really doing? And that takes courage to do that self-awareness, because then you need to model. Model is going to be the way that they grab everything, but starts with what we're doing, what we're saying, what we're thinking, and that self-awareness takes some courage again. So courage and model, that would be.
Yep.
Amazing. Well, Venus and Alejandra, I know we're at time, and certainly on behalf of the Greater Austin Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, and as well, certainly the Inclusion Plus Institute, certainly as a Latina, I have learned so much today as well. And this has been such a deeply meaningful and incredibly educational conversation. Certainly to all of our guests, we thank you for joining us today. This certainly represents our ongoing efforts to provide the most valuable and relevant content that we can to our members, while also welcoming new community partners to the table to join us in conversation. Venus, certainly I know we'll be sharing some content. I'll let you share those details with the participants.
Yeah, so you will receive a handout that shows you celebrations, how to do it respectfully throughout next year, and also inviting you to the next complimentary webinar, which is the D&I 101 next Friday. Same Betty channel, same Betty time. And also we put the link to feedback. It's a gift for us to hear from you. If you wouldn't mind clicking on that and giving us some of your feedback, that would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. We'll be in touch via email with those promised deliverables. We thank you all. We wish you a beautiful weekend ahead, a very happy Halloween and upcoming Dia de los Muertos, if it is a holiday that you certainly would love to observe. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you, and we will see you next week.
Thank you for partnering with us, Brittany and
Thank you.
John.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Brittany. Thank you, Venus. Thank